Welcome to What's the Purpose of It, the podcast where we challenge the current work paradigm and explore how to shift from competition to regeneration, from stress to purpose. Let's rethink work together.
Romania is one of the last remaining places in Europe where there is still genuine biodiversity and things to preserve. So we've been using the atmosphere as a dumping ground for methane, CO2 and other gases. We've been using the oceans as a dumping ground for plastic. And we've been using pretty much every patch of soil on the planet, including our own bodies, as a dumping ground for chemicals called PFAS and PFOA, which never break down and cause all kinds of illnesses. And suddenly we start to have to pay the bill for that. And Trump is not kidding at all when he says he wants to take over Greenland. There's a very strategic reason for that. If your economy grows at 3% per year, which is kind of a standard expectation for most governments, within 20 years you double your economy. And doubling your economy, we have historically never managed to do that without also increasing CO2 emissions, pollutions, waste, cutting down forests, using up more materials, digging up the earth, etc., etc. Dematerialize the economy and then we can grow forever without increasing the strain that we put on the natural environment is just not true. It's never been historically materialized. We have to act as if collapse has already happened so that we can process it, grieve it, stop hoping that we can prevent it, because pretty much we can. We can mitigate, definitely.
Hi there, Genie. I'm so happy we finally get the chance to talk. We have today a very special guest, Genie Servant Miklos, which is an assistant professor at the Erasmus University in the Netherlands and an associate member of the Club of Rome. And the topic she brings on, it's not an easy one to digest. So I'm just instructing everyone to just sit down, take a tea, have some deep breaths, and then, Genie, what is happening? Why is the world collapsing? What is this collapse all about? Everybody talks about it, but mostly in the environment topic. Do we have to look at it from any other angles?
Well, first, thanks for having me here, and I recommend your listeners take a whiskey rather than a tea for this topic. Yeah, so I think it's a great mistake to separate what's going on with the environment and what's going on with politics, society, and economics. In my book, Pedagogies of Collapse, I spent a whole chapter outlining what I actually mean with collapse. Even though it's a book about education and psychology, I thought it's good that we understand, what are we talking about when we use this word, because a lot of people are surprised by my choice of words. They're like, that's a pretty strong word. What exactly do you mean here? So I'm one of these people who sees the economy as part of a larger system, which is the biosphere. What I said in the book is, from the moment that you see the economy as a bunch of primates, i.e. us humans, moving things around on a hunk of rock hanging in empty space, it looks a lot less like some kind of mystical religion, and it makes our precarious situation a lot more obvious. So the basic problem we have is that we have an economic system that depends on growing the economy forever on a finite planet. Now, 1 + 1, or physics, should teach anyone that this isn't physically possible. If your economy grows at 3% per year, which is kind of a standard expectation for most governments, within 20 years, you double your economy. And doubling your economy, we have historically never managed to do that without also increasing CO2 emissions, pollutions, waste, cutting down forests, using up more materials, digging up the earth, etc., etc. Because the economy isn't something abstract. It's how much stuff do you produce per year in your country. That's what GDP measures. And then people say, oh yeah, but the service economy and technology, surely it's not material anymore. God, do you know how much electricity AI uses? or like Bitcoin. Bitcoin uses more electricity than Sweden.
Wow.
So this idea that we can dematerialize the economy and then we can grow forever without increasing the strain that we put on the natural environment is just not true. It's never been historically materialized. So we have a fundamental problem in that we've been treating the planet as a free and infinite source of resources to grow our economies and a free and infinite waste bin to throw all our trash. The problem is that it's not infinite. So we've been using the atmosphere as a dumping ground for methane and CO2 and other gases. We've been using the oceans as a dumping ground for plastic. And we've been using pretty much every patch of soil on the planet, including our own bodies, as a dumping ground for chemicals called PFAS and PFOA, which never break down and cause all kinds of illnesses. And also for pesticides and all kinds of things. And suddenly we start to have to pay the bill for that. And that doesn't just mean, oh no, there's less birds in the sky and there's no snow to go skiing in winter or those kinds of things. Like that is tragic in and of itself. But what I'm talking about is we built an entire economic system and therefore an entire civilization on the premise that all those things are going to be available to us forever. Whereas as we're speaking, we've pretty much dug out all the oil that was easy to pull out of the soil, all the minerals and things that were easy to get out to produce what we can do to keep the economy growing. So when I talk about collapse, it's very intertwined because, for instance, oil production has stopped growing. And you can say, oh, but there's loads of oil under, like, we can just keep fracking. But actually, it's the return on investment. So it gets harder and harder and more expensive to pull this stuff out of the ground. And more you need to go to extreme places like Greenland to get this kind of thing. And then you start to have the world order that was built on the premise that we could grow forever, that we could forever maintain peace with global trade, that we didn't need to fight over resources anymore because there was enough for everyone. Well, that's not true anymore. And so you start to hear things, and Trump is not kidding at all when he says he wants to take over Greenland. There's a very strategic reason for that. So we see that as the environment starts to fritter away and it becomes less easy to produce food, and it becomes less easy to take oil out of the ground. And as hurricanes start to destroy more things and the bill gets higher and higher, and there's more and more debt in the economy to pay for all the damage, like in Valencia, where the prime minister announced, oh, but the government will pay for the repairs with debt. Yeah. But then at some point, we're all like, there was an article published in Nature not long ago that said that within 25 years, there will be at least 19% decrease in global GDP, 19%. That's like 2 to 3 times COVID forever, not for 2 years, forever. And that is a low estimate. And that is if we stop adding to the problem, which
right
it
now
looks like we're going to do. So that's already baked in. So that's what I mean with collapse. It's like a very systemic end to the economic system and all the social, political, human ways of living that we all take for granted every day all over the planet. And it's going to come crashing down very suddenly in shocks. It's not going to be like a slow process. It's going to be like a war here, a drought there, a famine there. And it's going to be all at once, like tumbling down a staircase.
So we're going to go spiraling pretty soon, and I think it's already starting. If we look at it very well, there are signs kind of all over the place. But I'm listening to you, and I have this contradiction in my head because I was just the other month at Davos at the World Economic Forum, and there were all these meetings in all these buildings of companies and all these conferences where everyone was talking about growth. So growth was the number one topic, growth and AI, the both of them, I have to give it to them. So everyone was talking about how we're supposed to be growing and how we're supposed to produce more and be smarter about it and work harder and so on and so forth. And this narrative is very familiar to me. I've learned it in school. School, it's all about we have to evolve, we have to work, we have to do stuff, we have to grow. So I'm hearing what you're saying, which is also very true to me. But at the same time, I'm thinking that my daughters are going now to school learning that this world is infinite. And they have to become very good citizens and very hard, productive workers. So is the education system we're currently under preparing us for what's coming? Can anything prepare us for that?
So no and yes. In my book, I did a lot of historical research on the origins of the education system as we know it. Until the Industrial Revolution, education was something that only children of the rich received, and mainly the boys, unless the girls were sent to convent or something like that. But the public education system, as you know it, was born with the Industrial Revolution, not because factory owners and government leaders suddenly saw the light and thought it would be a great thing to give children an education and a sense of meaning and purpose. No, actually, it's tragicomic that the main problem that they had during the Industrial Revolution with young children was that because they were sent into the factories from 5, 7 years of age onwards, children were getting drunk to cope with the trauma of having to work long shifts in factories. I have a 7-year-old at home, and to imagine her working in a factory, you can understand why these kids were drunk and disorderly. And so schools were actually built as a way to instill discipline, obedience, and understanding of the factory system. In rural France, they were used to teach time to the peasants because time wasn't really a thing. And then the school clock introduced people to the idea of factory time with shifts and hours. So early schools had bells, whistles, quartermasters, things like that. Everyone standing in a row, and with older students serving as quartermasters for the teachers to instill the sense of discipline and authority. And basically, the history books I read from America, the UK, continental Europe, all point to public schools being a place where you learn to be a good worker under the capitalist system of production. So it shouldn't be a surprise at all. What I wrote in my book is it's not that the mission of schools has changed fundamentally. Their only purpose in the public there are, of course, exceptions, and I talk in the book about critical pedagogy, Bildung, certain kinds of traditions that defy that. But generally, taxpayer-funded public education has the purpose of feeding workers into the production apparatus. And so it should come as no surprise, since that production apparatus depends on growth for survival, that the schools also teach growth as like the basic fundament of our societies. And not at all how to cope with an end of that system. Whereas that end is actually really close. We're like, if this research that's coming out in Nature, which is one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world, if this research is even half correct, then certainly within your and my lifetime, definitely before it could be before my daughter even finishes school. And
I
all
have
of
the same thoughts.
so the current public education system is not at all facing those facts because it's not built to.
Mm-hmm.
And there are very few alternative education systems or places or institutions that do this kind of work. And the ones that do exist are under great strain. I just learned that Schumacher College, which was always touted as one of the leading world shining examples of eco-pedagogy, closed down or went bankrupt last year. I was one of the last people then to go to their summer courses last summer. And within, I think, 2 or 3 weeks after the end of that course, they declared bankruptcy and all the students were sent home. I'm trying to do that work also with the Bildung Climate School, inspired by the folk high schools in Scandinavia. But we're fighting against a monstrous machinery that has denial at its core, and getting through to education leaders, from program manager to dean to rector to minister of education, the urgency, the idea that sustainability doesn't mean let's be nice to the bees, but don't collapse. Those things I have tried and tried for a number of years now to get that message across. And at the end of the day, I had just kind of a it's enough moment. I was asked to headline the first inter-university sustainability summit in the Netherlands. And our universities are under strenuous attack from far-right politicians. I think you guys in Romania are getting that idea as well now.
Know how that feels.
Well, they said they were going to close the universities, and they're doing their damnedest to actually make that a reality. So they cut 1 billion euros of funding from science in universities in the Netherlands. And I stood in front of 200 people, including the rectors of the University of Applied Science and my university, and I said the university system is collapsing. And at the point we're at, I'm inclined to say, just let it, because you guys are not doing anything to help yourselves. So let's build something that is suitable for what's coming our way and work on that instead of, I don't know, using up all this energy trying to shore up something that's going to fall apart anyways.
Yeah, doesn't it feel sometimes that this system is like a very big octopus with a lot of arms, but they're all very, very sick. Like I feel the gangrene in all of the arms, and it just feels like it needs to die and collapse. And you said something very interesting. You said that you are dealing with a lot of systems and people that are in denial of collapse. Now, what I've seen is that for myself, denial is actually very helpful. You know, when I see something bad coming my way, the easiest way to face it is just pretend it's not happening. So I'm wondering, why are we so resistant to seeing this reality? What is the stake for the individual, for the companies, for the education system? Why do we prefer to just deny?
That's a very complex question. I have an entire chapter on this in my book. So, and I look at it through three different lenses: a cognitive lens, an existential lens, and a psychoanalytical lens. So I can't summarize everything, but I'll try and give you, especially something I feel might resonate with our Romanian listeners, because I talk about Romania. For those who don't know, I'm married to a Romanian. My husband is from Reagan in Transylvania. So I do talk about Romania in the book, and about particularly the experience of post-communist countries in facing up to what's happening with the world now. I'd like to really emphasize that I don't think well, that's not true, not any, but most people don't do it out of malice. There are definitely oil industry executives and other far-right politicians who do it out of malice, and also to make loads of money. But I think the majority of people care about the environment, care about the future of society, and generally have positive feelings towards their fellow human beings. Again, at the top, you'll find a crop of narcissistic sociopaths who now apparently run America. And
Leaving egocentric people aside, let's talk about all the rest of us.
Yeah, I mean, we shouldn't dismiss egocentric people because they inevitably float to the top, and they also have this way of well, we'll talk about why. I have this lecture that I give that is very popular among students. It's called "Why Do We Love Dickheads?"
I need to hear that one time.
And it's a psychoanalytic lecture about what is our fascination with old, white, semi-fascistic men who promise that they're going to save us with penis-shaped objects that they can send to Mars. So I have a whole lecture on this. It's written in the book chapter 3 if you're
I want to be your student now. All of a sudden, I want to go to school.
But so let's talk about the people and why our instinctual reaction is not to deal with this reality. It's not because we're bad people. It's because it is so fundamentally overwhelming, so distressing to think about having to live under those circumstances with war on our doorstep, or here, if you, for instance, right now, even across the border from Romania, you have a war going on. And everyone was in denial about this until the day he walked the tanks into Ukraine. And everybody was in denial about Trump overthrowing American democracy until he did it. No one wants to think that their children are going to have to die on the front lines of some completely random act of aggression. Nobody wants to think that their children won't have enough food to eat. Nobody wants to think that they're going to lose access to hot water, central heating, or even their homes. Nobody wants to think that they won't know where their next income is going to come from. Increasingly, young people who've been to school and were told if you go to school and you study, and especially in post-communist countries, that pull of the capitalist narrative of meritocracy, just work hard, go to school. And for Romanians, it's been largely true since the end of the Soviet Union.
Kind of worked. For the last 30 years, it worked.
I mean, my husband is a typical example. He came from a quite poor family in Reagan. I've seen the apartment where he grew up, and it was covered in mold, and it was, one of these old communist towers in Reagan. And both his parents were factory workers. And like he went through this brutal, unhelpful Romanian education system that does anything but help children thrive. And he just buckled down, and his only wish was to get the hell out of Romania. And he studied engineering, not because he was passionate about engineering, but because that's what gets you jobs. And he graduated, he went to university in Cluj. He did a semester abroad in Germany because European exchange is allowed you to do that. And then he got his first job was in a huge multinational, the patent office here in the Netherlands. And like that changed his life, his family's life, etc. My sister-in-law is a dentist now working in France. And so for Romanians, that progress narrative has been a very real thing. And when you've just gotten out, and my father-in-law told me a little bit about the last years of the Ceausescu regime, the 80s in Romania, and how awful life was for people in that time. When you get out of that trauma,
you don't want to go into a new one.
You don't want to go, like the last thing you want to do is go, and this could all happen again. And you guys
even worse,
this close to electing a fascist to power. Someone who would welcome Russian aggression with open arms, whose entire campaign is based on cheating, lying, and disinformation, which is so reminiscent of the Ceausescu years. You can understand a little bit how people have kind of forgotten the Second World War, because the people who lived through that are slowly dying out. But Ceausescu was what, like 30 years ago? 40? Yeah. So that people are already forgetting what it was like to live under a system of persistent nepotism, corruption, where everything was based on who you knew and who you reported on, and not on merit or hard work. And to be so eager to go back to that, I think taps into, and I'm going to go and say like basic psychoanalysis. When we're faced with something that we can't process, we regress into a state of childlike immaturity. And that regression makes us look for father figures
that are going to save us and take care of us.
Yeah.
Well, since apparently there's a lot of things that we cannot avoid, it's kind of a little bit too late. And I actually remember that a few months ago, right at the end of last year, I was on Google, and I don't know what I was searching, but all of a sudden there was this like suggestions from Google with top 10 jobs in 2050, something like that. And I started checking it out, and I started reading, and it was all about becoming IT. So it was the fanciest IT job titles. And all of a sudden I got so curious, like 2050, everybody should be an IT guy. Okay, so I went to AI and I asked ChatGPT, hey, ChatGPT, if by 2050, humankind doesn't do anything to fix its social governance issues, climate issues, how will the world look? Can you generate me a picture of that? And you can imagine how the picture looks like. Everything ruins, everything collapsed, zombie land all over the place, people hungry, very thin, no sun. And I was thinking, will we need that many IT guys in a world like that? Is that what we need right now? So since we have to embrace collapse at some point, and we're going to get out of denial sooner or later, can we do that in a healthy way? Can we embrace collapse without collapsing?
You mean collapsing psychologically?
Yeah, psychologically, from a mental health point of view. Because I'm thinking of people that are like listening right now. So these two ladies are not very positive. They're very like, are they upset? What happened with them this morning? They have no reasons to be happy. It's not going to be called realism. It's going to be called that we're too emotional, we're too exaggerated. And at some point in time, people are going to start seeing the signs that we are probably seeing right now. How are they supposed to embrace that without collapsing internally?
Yeah, so I have been called an alarmist by people, but of course I'm not a climate scientist or a bioengineer, so I just report the findings of thousands of scientists and the top-notch science that's reported in scientific journals. And to be honest, we can see it with our own eyes, right? How are winters going for you guys in Romania right now?
It's super sunny outside. And do you want me to tell you about the summer? This summer when we had almost 40 degrees.
Oh, I know, I was there. I was in Romania when it was 40 degrees last summer.
No snow. It's super sunny. The whole winter was perfectly fine. It's like very Mediterranean all of a sudden.
And that's, of course, going to accelerate exponentially because there's almost no chance we stay below 2 degrees of warming at this stage. So there's a great saying within the French kind of public debate about this. There's a guy called Jean-Marc Jancovici who says, the problem is there, and either way, you can either take care of it or not. But if you don't take care of the problem takes care of you. So ultimately, what happens, we're seeing in real time, our experiment with global denial is that the Russians show up with their tanks and Trump dismantles American democracy and hurricanes slam into various places, causing billions of euros of damage, and Los Angeles is on fire. So we can keep denying, but then the problem takes care of us. So, and there are a lot of people will say, oh, well, maybe humans are the virus and it's a good thing to get rid of humans. I hear this reaction a lot, but usually when people say this, they mean the other humans, not me.
Not me. I am composting. Not me. The other ones. The ones that are not composting and using plastic straws.
And there's also usually a very thin line between saying that and somebody coming up with a racist idea to put that into practice.
Yeah, like those ones, there are too many. Yeah.
So we see a big link with eco-fascism. But if I want to talk about how do we process all of this, there's a philosopher that I don't recommend anybody read because he's crazy and impossible to read. He's from Slovenia. He's called Slavoj Žižek. But he did say something very interesting, which I subscribe to, which is we have to act as if collapse has already happened so that we can process it, grieve it, stop hoping that we can prevent it, because pretty much we can't. We can mitigate, definitely. We can minimize the damages, but the feedback mechanisms are already in place, meaning it's quasi impossible that we stay below 2 degrees of warming. And so all the stable systems we're relying on, also, we can't produce more oil because it takes millions of years for oil to be produced. So those things are already in motion. And so Zizek says if we accept that collapse is already here, then we can grieve. And the grief part is more something that I, and it's mainly women who work in this field of talking about ecological grief or climate grief, but do this grieving process, go through that cycle, the Kubler-Ross cycle, the 5 stages of grief. So we have to go through the 5 stages of grief to accept that the world as we know it cannot continue. And once we're able to go through that cycle of grief, start thinking, okay, so now what do we do? So it's about really making the space to process that. And I use specific pedagogical tools because I work in education. So I use specific pedagogical tools to go through this with my students. I developed a method called experimental pedagogics, which relies very strongly on existential, like it has a strong existential foundation. Why existentialism? And I think if I'm talking to like an average person that's not one of my students, that's not, doesn't have a full course with me, one of the most inspiring authors, if I was to tell you go and read a book, I would say read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. It's one of the key texts that I give my students to read. He was a Jewish psychiatrist that survived the concentration camps during the Second World War. And he, in his very graphic account of living in Auschwitz, he gives an account of what he found, the reason he found to live for and to keep going, even though being a prisoner in Auschwitz is possibly the worst thing that you can possibly imagine in terms of the dehumanization and the deliberate humiliation and taking away all humanity from this person. He wanted to share his knowledge about psychiatry with the world. That was his purpose. And he says, he who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. And so connecting with my favorite existential authors, Simone de Beauvoir, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, really connecting with what is the purpose, what gives you meaning. And then you'll see that our lives, this progress narrative that so many Romanians embrace. Oh, we have smartphones now, we have nicer cars now, we have all the stuff we were deprived of as children. My husband tells me about the first time he drank Coca-Cola and that kind of stuff. That those things are all devoid of meaning. And so this is an opportunity to actually reconnect with something that was also taken away during the communist period. Like during the communist period, you didn't really have a choice to find some existential purpose. You were too busy fighting for survival, constantly in trauma mode about who's going to report you to the secret police or whatever. And then under capitalism, you're in that post-trauma mode of just accumulating all the things you can, like someone who's been starved and like stuffing their face until they die of obesity. And I think I see that a lot in Romania, this like dying of obesity, but of like over consuming shit basically
Over consuming, overworking.
Yeah.
Also, I can tell you from everything I noticed, from my behavior and from many people around me, and of course, it's not the ultimate truth, but it's part of the truth. We kind of like overworking, because it was our lifeline. So overworking, being a workaholic in Romania, became for many people the lifeline. This is how we saved ourselves. And then we kind of got hooked in the system of I need to work more so I can produce money to buy the things that I want and give me status, but then I will have to work more to take care of them, and I will never get the chance to use them and be happy with them. But we're too busy working to notice that this is happening to us. But most of the time, there's a nice burnout or a nice depression or a nice disease that comes in and punches us in the face and tells us that, hey, you're in this loop. Maybe you should get out of it. And some people do, and some, they just go back to the old-fashioned way of doing things. But yeah, I can relate with everything you just said. And we're getting close to the end of our talk, although it could go on for hours. But I will strongly advise everyone that's listening to us right now to just deep dive into your book, which I'm also looking forward to do after our talk. I specifically didn't read it, so I don't know what we're talking about, so I can be a newbie in the topic. Before we end, like most people listening to us right now, they have jobs. They're in the system. It's a bad system, it's a good system, doesn't matter anymore. They're in it. And these are people that have their kids in school, they go to their jobs, they try to just make some plans for one vacation a year maybe, they're not really at home thinking, hey, will my child have food in 15 years from now? Should I be worried about climate change? Should I have like a piece of land so I can put some tomatoes? Maybe I will starve in 20 years from now. These are the last things that are on these people's mind. And I can totally relate to that. We're just living as usual. What should they start doing differently in order to embrace this idea that it's it's collapsing? Go through the grieving process and then do what?
So I think Romanians have a kind of a chance that here in Holland we definitely don't have anymore, which is you still have in the countrysides in Romania people who are living a life that it would still be possible. And actually, for those people, not as much will change after civilizational collapse than for people living in the center of Bucharest or Cluj. Um, and so you have a chance to get that knowledge and to reconnect with those people living a life that is far more sustainable. And they're around you. You don't have to go too far to find those people and talk with them and reconnect with them. And for me, I come from France, not the Netherlands, and I know, that my grandmother had all these skills. My grandmother was a factory worker, but nonetheless, during the Second World War, she had all these skills of growing and processing food, and she had 6 kids, and all the clothes were made by her. And those things I know full well that when you're only 1 or 2 generations from having gotten out of that, the last thing you want to do is go back in
Going
there.
back.
But um, to reconnect with our capacity to create with our hands, with our elders in the villages where they still live, that is something Romanians will find less hard to do than people who live here in the Netherlands have been completely disconnected for multiple generations. And I think, like, I noticed that Romanians, and I don't want this to come across the wrong way, but I notice very often that Romanians feel they have to catch up with the rest of Europe, and that it's like as fast as we can go, just work harder and all of that. And I'd say Romanians could become a leading example of reconnecting. Uh, you guys still have some biodiversity. I mean, you still have primeval forests if you don't let IKEA keep cutting them down. Those are things Romanians could be fighting for right now to preserve the last of the primitive forests before these multinational corporations log them down. Because once those forests are gone, you'll never grow them back. So there are a lot of things that Romanians can do right now, and action is one of the best ways to cope and get out of that despair. There are so many things, preserving the biodiversity in the countryside, stopping these monocultures from taking over in these beautiful countryside fields where you still have different crops growing alongside each other, stopping the lumbering of the primeval forests. Like, Romania is one of the last remaining places in Europe where there is still genuine biodiversity and things to preserve. I mean, in Holland, it's way too late. We've destroyed everything. But that's a combat that Romanian people need to feel is important to them and need to take that on urgently because it's exponential. So within 10 years, it'll be too late to save those forests and to preserve that biodiversity. So that would be my call to action is like, take the space and the time to grieve, but then get to work. I mean, you still have things you can protect. We don't.
Yeah. And there's always been this narrative in Romania that we're 10, 20 years behind all the modern countries. And I'm so happy to see that now this behind means actually we're kind of ahead. And that's a very good piece of news for me. And just last, what should companies do different? Like we're talking about mental health in the workplace and how this crazy world puts people under a lot of pressure. What can companies do in this world of collapse to just, I don't know, redirect their business orientation and also help employees to just get into a more of a regenerative mindset?
Yeah, I mean, companies need to realize that if the ecosystems in Romania collapse, their companies will collapse as well. There's
That might be important for them.
that's there's no economy, there's no end of year bonuses for executives in a country where there's no ecosystems left. I mean, Holland is finding this out the hard way now that we've destroyed everything. That's part of what spurred the rise of the populist movements here is the farmers' revolt, because we can't, like, we have so much nitrogen everywhere. But I'm not going to go into the situation in Holland right now. But like, the companies need to realize that their entire business model depends on preserving the free resources that nature's kind enough to provide them with. Romanian companies need to get out also because companies are actually, what are the people that run these companies, right? Companies are abstract entities, but they're run by people at the end of the day.
Sure.
And the executives that run these Romanian companies need to get out of that trauma mindset as well and look around and go, whoa, you know what? Romania is a country where if we act now to preserve what's left, our kids could actually, because I have no hope that Holland is anywhere, like, we're 7 meters below sea level. There's Holland, there's a reason I haven't given up my French citizenship because I don't think this is a good bet for in 50 to 60 years. But I do think that Romania has a lot to offer, and companies have way more power than individuals. Companies could right now pressure the government to stop the illegal logging of Romanian forests, and they could get their employees on board, and they could right now act to preserve biodiversity. It's a choice. It's an existential choice that company executives are making to make sure there is no future for their kids or other kids in Romania. And like, I just want to confront executives in those companies with their existential, like, what is the meaning of their life? Do they want to be at the helm of companies that are actively participating in destroying what's left of Romanian natural heritage? Or do they want to, participate in preserving and regenerating? Romania has the potential to do a lot of good things in this field if they stop. I mean, if they think the American dream is the model to follow, look where that got the Americans. It's not working out so well for them right now, is it?
True. And I cannot think of a better way to end this talk as the question you just addressed, like, do they want to be the ones responsible for the extension of everything we have here, or the ones that are going to lead the regeneration process? So Genie, thanks a million for everything. It has been so insightful, and I would advise our audience, if it was a little bit too much, to just take a deep breath and before starting to talk with your friends about it, just let it sink in and digest a little bit. And also a big heads up, when you're gonna start talking about this, you're going to be called in many ways. You're going to be the apocalyptic, you're going to be the emotional one. What were your nicknames, Ginny, when you're talking about collapse?
Oh, I've been called all kinds of things.
Okay.
Alarmist.
Alarmist. Okay, so you're going to be put in a corner for a while, but maybe it's time to just not choose the comfort roles and just spit it out and put it out there. Thank you so much, Genie, and I really hope we're going to get the chance to talk more about this in some other episodes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining What's the Purpose of It? Until the next time, keep challenging the rules, rethinking the norm, and building workplaces where purpose leads the way. See you soon.